Two, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2.
Queen's University Belfast, and this is a place of open minds, of learning, of debates and discussion. So no better setting for this evening's proceedings, whether you're an Irish Republican or a British Unionist or you're something else. So welcome to you all in the room. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if you smell smoke, make your way out of the building. Go in a calm manner, follow the green signs to get outside. Now, if you're watching live, or maybe you're watching back later on, if you want to become involved in the conversation, use the hashtag on social media, Ireland's Future. And for those in the room, if you want to contribute to the online discourse, use that as well. So I'm Amanda Ferguson. I am a North Belfast woman. I'm a journalist, I'm a broadcaster and an event host. And when Ireland's Future booked me for this, to chair proceedings this evening, I was delighted to accept. As I outlined previously, I want to be at the centre of these conversations because they're continuing at pace, and as people set out their competing stalls in the time ahead, I think it's maybe a duty on all of us to be involved in these conversations. So the format for proceedings is that each speaker is going to have roughly 7 minutes or so to make opening remarks. Then I will ask some questions, and then I'll throw the mic out to you to ask some questions as well. So we should be done by about 7:15 roughly. We'll see how well we are at timekeeping. So last night I was watching the Open University linked documentary that's on the BBC, Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland, and it was a very open look at the role of Republicans, loyalists and the state in the hurt and the harm of the past in this place. And it made me angry and it made me sad as well. But it was a reminder that dialogue is a threat to no one. And as dairyman Richard Moore from Children in Crossfire said, peace is tough. And I think we've learned that over the last 25 years. So here we are 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and Queen's hosted a major 3-day conference which reflected on what happened in 1998, what worked well, what hasn't worked so well, where we need to do better and what's next. So the discussion tonight is focusing on the next 25 years, on what next. And we have 4 speakers who I'm sure that you can notice the lineup has changed ever so slightly. From the Alliance Party, we have Dr. Stephen Farry, the North Down MP. Now, Nuala McAllister, the MLA for North Belfast, was due to represent Alliance this evening, but she had family business to take care of. So we wish Nuala and her family all the best and look forward to welcoming her another time. We also have on the panel former Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams, who, as Brendan pointed out, is also a trampoline enthusiast. So we'll put that in his bio as well. We have academic Professor Brendan O'Leary, who is the author of Making Sense of United Ireland. He's not a member of any political party. He is a registered Democrat, and he's been described as he described himself to me as a Southerner who became a Northerner. So we also have former Fianna Fáil advisor, Senator, TD, the list goes on, Martin Mansergh, and that is our panel of speakers today. So first up, and I know we've done the order here, no preferential treatment. It was the order that the panel arrived in. So we're going to start by welcoming Professor Brendan O'Leary. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Amanda. I'd like to thank the organisers, and I'd like to clarify something immediately. I am a member of ARINS, that is Analysing and Researching Ireland North and South. ARINS takes no position on the question of unification or the union. In that respect, it's just like the Alliance Party. You're not alone. That is not my personal position. Having written a book on making sense of a united Ireland, I can't be described as neutral, though as a professor, I'm obliged to be ruled by evidence. I'd first of all like to begin by defending myself. If you watch the Twitter sphere, you will have noticed some people complaining about the notion of losers' consent, and indeed successfully misinterpreting it. If you're explaining you're losing but I need to explain. The notion of losers' consent does not imply any fresh veto power, any new veto power. It has nothing to do with vetoes. Democracy works best either in elections or in referendums if the losers accept the results. And it's important that the prospective winners think carefully how to increase the likelihood that the losers will accept the results. Donald Trump is a perfect example of a bad loser, right? That's what has to be avoided. In my book, Making Sense of United Ireland, I make categorically clear, notice the plug for the book, just in case you didn't notice. I make categorically clear that the future referendums in both jurisdictions proceed on the basis of simple majority rule. There are no qualified majorities, no thresholds, no quotas, no community vetoes. Ian Paisley's project to try and modify the rules will not work because the Good Friday Agreement is not only an international treaty which embeds these obligations, it's now an international treaty with 27 EU member states obliged to respect the Good Friday Agreement in all its parts and in all its dimensions. So what I want to talk about in my brief remarks is questions of strategy for accomplishing reunification. And I want to make the argument in several parts. First of all, it's prudent, it's ethical to try and maximize losers' consent. According to the Aaron surveys that we conducted last year, almost 2/3 of Northern Protestants would accept the outcome of a future referendum if it resulted in Irish unity. But 1/3 would find that result almost impossible to accept, quotation marks. Now, what does that mean? It's not obviously clear. Peter Robinson makes clear that he would accept the outcome. Arlene Foster appeared to imply that she would emigrate if that were to be the outcome. That, I think, would be an unfortunate result. So we have to think carefully about this particular category of persons. They would be roughly 1 in 21 adults in a prospective United Ireland. It doesn't mean that they need to be granted any kind of veto. It does mean that their concerns and anxieties need to be addressed. And what we've found in our surveys so far is that their number one priority that makes accepting a United Ireland more plausible for them is the retention of their British citizenship only in the context of United Ireland. Now, that would have a price. Under current constitutional arrangements, it would mean that they would not be able to vote in constitutional referendums in the Republic, and they wouldn't be able to vote for the president. But nothing in the terms of the Good Friday Agreement prevents that particular provision from being made available. Their second important preference is for the preservation of socialized medicine, like the National Health Service. That's preferred also by Northern Catholics. In both cases, there seems to be extraordinarily poor levels of information. The Southern health system outperforms the Northern health system, but all types of Northerner prefer the principles of the NHS. So if you want to maximize losers' consent, the model of a United Ireland has to go some way, at least, in the direction of socialized medicine. Thirdly, they like secular education. So those would be the minimal components of trying to maximize losers' consent. The maximal components would be contemplating protecting Ulster Scots, making sure that there are provisions for unionists to participate in future Dublin governments, and lastly, and probably most controversially in this room, a devolved Northern Ireland persisting inside a United Ireland. That is allowed for in the Constitution of Ireland. It was put there by De Valera, and there was a previous version of that provision in the Constitution of the Irish Free State, insisted upon by Michael Collins. While pursuing the strategy of maximizing losers' consent, the base can't be lost. Let me give you two examples. It's quite clear that the Northern nationalists here and the population in the South resist strongly any idea of transforming the flag, the tricolour, and the anthem, even if the anthem contains references to the Saxon foe that might not be considered diplomatic. Now, there's no point in changing those particular arrangements unless they move hardline Protestant and Unionist opinion. And they don't, according to our surveys. So this is not an area where a great deal of attention needs to be focused. By contrast, joining the Commonwealth, which is really disliked among Southerners, is an easy symbolic change to contemplate. The Commonwealth has no legislative, executive, or judicial authority over any of its members. It's not even the British Commonwealth, and it hasn't been since India forced the name change in 1948. It's a reasonable compromise to think of Irish unity involving a return to the European Union for the North, and in return, a symbolic rejoining of the Commonwealth. By the way, the Commonwealth doesn't even require that the next head will be King Billy III. There is no obligation under the current provisions of the Commonwealth that the British monarch be the continuing head of that organization. Next question, winning the base in the North. Lots of people are very confident as a result of the recent local government elections in the North. The combined nationalist vote, contemplating all sorts of parties and individual independents, was roughly speaking 44%. The first time there's a Northern majority in plurality in local government elections. But that doesn't mean that there's an immediate prospect of victory. And that's because a very significant number of Northern Catholics are either in the don't know category, a very large, nearly all the don't knows, not all of them, are cultural Catholics. And there are a significant number of Catholic Unionists. What should be done about Catholic Unionists? Maximum feasible politeness. Point out to them that the United Kingdom is not a success story. Point out that the government of that Ireland is better governed, more democratic, more liberal, more prosperous, and indeed now less Catholic. It's also better educated across any dimension of education you care to mention. Treat them with courtesy. You're not likely to convert them. If they're rational conservatives, they like living under a conservative government, well, they've got a 3 in 4 chance of getting that, judging by the record since 1951. If they're socialists, liberals, environmentalists, Greens, feminists, and they don't like conservative governments, then they should consider a united Ireland. The second category of cultural Catholic who is not apparently minded in favor of united Ireland are those whom I argue appear to have an information deficit. Now, the reason for that information deficit could be media silos in Northern Ireland. The British media do not do Northern Irish and Republic of Ireland comparisons. By and large, they focus on intra-UK comparisons. Those who consume Southern media, naturally enough, receive the criticisms of the Southern government's performance. And that, of course, is magnified because the media accentuate the negative, because the negative is more newsworthy. There's an additional problem. The most successful opposition party in the South is Sinn Féin. It's also the most successful party with Northern nationalists and by some margin. But there's a problem there because, of course, when Sinn Féin is critical of the Southern government's performance, that creates a potential psychological effect among some Northern nationalists. Why would we want to join a state which apparently appears to be underperforming? Now, of course, some of you will draw the conclusion that the rational solution is to have Sinn Féin in government in the South, and that will remove the tension because Sinn Féin will then have to defend the performance of the Southern government. But my point is that psychological tension may partly explain the lack of full enthusiasm for unification among cultural Catholics. They basically need to be informed about the stunning performance of the Republic of Ireland. It is remarkably rich in GDP per capita. It outperforms the United States in GDP per capita. None of this is fake. The revenues that flow from Ireland's tax policies are genuine and quite stunning. Health and education are indeed subjects that could do with even more resources, particularly the university sector, if I may give a plug. And housing and health are obviously under significant strain. But that does not mean that the Republic of Ireland is a failure. Far from it. It's a dramatic success story. And cultural Catholics need to be informed about that. The third difficulty, and this is my own idea, it may be wrong, I call it the Valley of Transition. Imagine that you could draw a line showing the performance of the Government of Ireland's economy over time. And below it is a line showing the performance of the UK economy over time. Imagine there's no recessions, so it's a simple world of straight lines. Going from the bottom UK line up to the Republic line is an obvious welfare enhancing move. So why aren't people immediately enthusiastic about doing it? All people. The answer, I believe, is that many of them are fearful of the transitional costs. Going from the UK curve to the Republic of Ireland curve is a V. You go down before you go up. They're fearful that Irish unification will be like German unification, tough for East Germany, with Northern Ireland being the equivalent of East Germany. Now, I believe that that's a real problem, fear of the costs of transition. It's both an economic fear and it's a fear attached to the possibility of a loyalist backlash. Both fears need to be squarely addressed. In my view, the economic fears can be rationally addressed by the Government of Ireland, devoting some of its very significant forthcoming budgetary surpluses to a sovereign wealth fund to address the potential costs of reunification. Note I say potential costs, because I think a lot of the arguments about the subvention are founded on myth rather than reality. My last point in introducing this evening's discussion, how am I doing for time? Right, okay. I haven't said finally, but I'm about to say finally. The Government of Ireland has an onus to prepare. In my judgment, it has to be ready by roughly 2030. Proper preparation, in my view, requires a Ministry of National Reunification. If the Koreans have one, why can't we? It also requires possibly a standing constitutional forum. I'm skeptical about the idea of using a citizens' assembly to address all these matters. Citizens' assemblies are excellent for specific questions like abortion, like a particular tax policy. But to give a citizens' assembly the entirety of the restructuring of Ireland is, I think, not appropriate. Last words. One of the key questions that will be faced in the future is whether to vote on a model of Irish unification articulated by the Government of Ireland, or to vote on principle on having a united Ireland and organise everything afterwards. My advice to you on that choice is straightforward. Go for the model. The evidence of public opinion is that all sections of the public are burnt by the Brexit experience. They want to know what they're going to vote on before they vote on it. So if you want to lose the referendum, argue for a vote on principle rather than a vote on a specific model. Secondly, don't go for a premature referendum. A premature referendum is like all other premature activities, a form of lacking in fulfillment that we should not see. And I think we need to address the question of fears, both in the south and in the north, squarely and with honesty. Lastly, it's very important that Northern nationalists not be seen as responsible for the failure of the Good Friday Agreement institutions to function. If that happens, it's important that the blame not be attached to the Northern parties. And I think currently the Democratic Unionist Party is making that particular objective very easy to obtain. Thank you for listening to me.
Thanks very much for that, Brendan. We'll just move swiftly on to Stephen Farry from the Alliance Party. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, and good evening, everyone. And as Amanda has already said, I am clearly not Nuala McAllister. Nuala has some issues with one of her children, and obviously has to give priority to that. So sends her apologies. And I am conscious that I have inadvertently turned this into a manual. That wasn't our intention. Also, just to say, we have had some very positive engagement with the members of the board of Ireland's Future today as well. So this is a double hit for me in terms of Ireland's Future events so far. By way of context, before getting in specifically to the issue of the future of the island of Ireland and constitutional questions, very specifically in relation to Ireland, I think it's useful just maybe touch upon the wider context first in relation to the Good Friday Agreement. And obviously we've had the 25th anniversary celebrated in the past few weeks, with notably Queen's University hosting an outstanding conference over several days, which is important again that we acknowledge. The Good Friday Agreement is, as you all appreciate, a complex document, set of interlocking relationships, including power sharing within Northern Ireland, but also the north-south, east-west dimensions, alongside human rights, equality, protections, policing reform, etc. And obviously, of course, the principle of consent in terms of determining the constitutional status of Northern Ireland going forward. The agreement, while the European Union was not, shall we say, central to the narrative at the time or the document itself, it was nonetheless implicit in the background, in the sense that the dual membership of the Single Market and Customs Union alongside the European Union made borders effectively disappear across these islands. And it was in that context that, shall we say, prior to Brexit, the constitutional question was not as alive as it is today. And for us in the Lands Party, and indeed for many in society, Brexit has been a major game changer in terms of energising that particular debate. The more we end up, however, in a situation where there is a breakdown of the agreement and its institutions, the more Brexit drives a black and white type situation on top of a context that requires different shades of grey, the more the British and Irish governments are putting in different directions, then the more difficult the environment is for having these conversations. We would much prefer to see a situation where we were doing this in that much more benign context. And also in that context, the stakes are a lot less in terms of the debate and in terms of how things fall for different people with different aspirations. Now, I know there's been a lot of interest in the Alliance Party approach to these issues. So to again explain that, and we're happy to do so, and I imagine we'll be asked this question many times over the next number of years. As a party, we are not defined by the constitutional question. That is a very deliberate choice on our part. We want to be a party that's defined by other issues, but principally how we overcome divisions in our society and build a shared and integrated society, how we promote reconciliation. We do recognise, however, that the constitutional question is a live debate. It is something that we are willing to engage with. As a party, we will have some members and voters and elected representatives who are pro-union and will always be pro-union. We will have some who are pro-United Ireland, and we have many people, including myself, who are open-minded on this issue. I wouldn't say that we're don't knows. We are people who are open to discussion and open to following the evidence and following the debate, and indeed taking part in the debate. Also, as a slight segue, we don't believe that the entire focus needs to be on political and constitutional matters. Notwithstanding what may happen in that regard, there is still very significant scope for developing practical North-South cooperation on a range of social, economic, environmental issues, and indeed development of the all-island economy. The potential in that regard is very much underdeveloped, and indeed perhaps the North-South aspects of the Good Friday Agreement are perhaps one of the least implemented aspects over the past 25 years. The irony, of course, was that in the talks themselves, it was the most thorny aspect, and the one that almost brought the talks down at one stage, approaching Good Friday itself. So we are open-minded to taking part in discussions. It will be on a without prejudice basis. We won't be taking any formal decision on as to how we approach the issue in terms of campaigning until a border poll is actually called. At that time, we could adopt a formal position as a party to campaign for an outcome, which could be for the union, which was our position in the 1973 border poll, or it could be potentially to campaign and support whatever constitutional proposition has been put forward, or we may well give our members a free vote in that regard. Now, that said, we're not going to sit back and simply await for developments to take place and to then take a decision on the matter. We are willing to take a place in open, constructive, evidence-based discussions, as long as that's on a without prejudice basis. We do believe that there is a very strong interest in ensuring that a referendum decision is based upon a fully fleshed out proposition. And I imagine that's probably going to be a point of consensus for all of us on the panel this evening. So we do want to see a process in place by which that can be developed, and we will play a role in that. There will be times when we don't take part in certain functions, certain events, if we feel that that is us implicitly or explicitly endorsing a particular outcome, where we see it as being an open forum, an open debate where issues can be talked about, and we can discuss those frankly. That is appropriate for us. I would even make the suggestion that even unionists should take part in that debate, because this goes to Brendan's point around acquiescence in terms of an outcome. And I did understand the point he was making about loser consent. And before we get to that point, just to stress that as far as we're concerned, we are committed to the 50% plus one model for that is established under the Good Friday Agreement, and that shouldn't be tampered with. It does need to be fleshed out in terms of exactly what the trigger points are going to be for that, and there's issues around the precise electorate that will be used, whether votes of 16 to 18, to what extent EU nationals and others are included in that. So those are all fair, legitimate points to discuss in that regard, but the 50+1 point to us is sacrosanct. That said, in terms of practical realities, we would prefer that any outcome, whatever outcome that may be, is a decisive one. We don't want to see a spiral of continued referenda, or a situation where we have people who are very disillusioned by the outcome. What I mean by acquiescence, and why I think it's important that even unionists engage in this discussion, even if you're never, ever going to be persuaded to campaign for change as part of a referendum. Nonetheless, if this is a clear and present prospect of change happening on the island, rather than waiting till there's a fait accompli and then trying to have a say once things have been locked in place, it is far better, even on a precautionary contingency basis, to be in the room and making their points and trying to shape the nature of what may emerge. And that is, I think, important for what may come down the line, because even in the sense where people are unsuccessful in terms of advocating their particular outcome, it is important at least they feel that their viewpoints have been taken into account in terms of how the nature of the future is put in place. I would also stress that for the central ground vote in Northern Ireland, there will be a lot of push and pull factors involved with it. And this may well change over time. This is not something that is fixed. For many people that I would represent, this is not an ideological question. It is something where people are open-minded, they are conscious of change, and they want to see evidence and take any decision down the line based upon evidence. Clearly, factors such as Brexit has already enlivened the debate. Also, there's a sense that particularly recent governments in London have become very toxic and haven't really had Northern Ireland's best interests at heart. There are still residual arguments around the public finances, and I'm happy to debate that with colleagues down the line, that do suggest that the UK option is better. Historically, also the NHS argument has been made in terms of the UK. That is contrasted by, and take what Brendan was saying in terms of what's happening with debates around health in Southern Ireland. But to our mind, while everything may not be free in the south, outcomes are now significantly better than what's happening in Northern Ireland. So our free health service is increasingly a notional free health service. So there is a clear, more balanced and nuanced debate to happen in that particular regard. Also, we are very conscious that the southern economy is booming. Productivity levels are well in excess of what's the case in Northern Ireland. Levels of educational attainment versus educational underattainment are clearly much better in the south as well. The skills base is better. The investment narrative is better. Job prospects are better. So those are all factors, and again, that reinforces the need for development of the all-island economy, as we need to be plugging into that to an increasing strength. Obviously, there may well be issues in terms of the nature of the debate that may well spook people in the centre ground as well, and be very conscious of that. And even a situation where something may well be fairly settled or consistent in opinion polling over a prolonged period of time, something can even change in the course of a debate of an actual real life referendum campaign and debate that may well send people off in different directions. So that middle ground can be pushed and pulled by a whole range of factors. So it is increasingly broad, but it's also increasingly shallow in terms of the ideological depth of feeling, and it is something that may well be seen as being very, very fluid. Looking to the future, we do think that there is some scope for having a more structured debate. Clearly, we do admire a lot of the work that Ireland's Future has done, but we do recognise that at some point in the future, there is a role for governments in this regard in terms of how planning is taken forward on a more formalised basis. Again, that needs to be on a without prejudice basis to our mind, but it does need to facilitate more structured engagement with key stakeholders and where we can actually get into real depth in terms of discussing some of the different issues and how that's to be taken forward. So from our point of view, we come to this with an open mind. We don't yet believe that the conditions exist for a border poll to take place, but we do respect that this is an ongoing and live debate. It isn't have to be, honestly, political priority for us at the moment compared to getting an assembly restored and addressing the cost of living issue and the lack of a budget. But nonetheless, we respect the debate and we are happy and willing to take part in that. But in return, I would ask that people respect our particular sense of identity as a cross-community party, and that we are people who are not defined and will not be defined by the constitutional question in our politics over the next number of years. But nonetheless, that we are willing to engage with different people with different political persuasions to see where there is some degree of common ground and to test the issues, and hopefully to play a role in formulating questions that may well be asked down the line, even if there's not necessarily any guaranteed prospect we will be voting in a particular direction at that time. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Next, we're going to hear from Jerry Adams. Jerry, if you want to come on up. Thank you.
Gora mila my August break that's Amanda August Ireland's Future taking a hand mar hug shivsha Sean Sogumsa a conscience shaw a knocked. So thanks to Ireland's Future, to our T, to Amanda for moderating these discussions, and to other speakers for taking part. And I want to commend the work of Ireland's Future, and also the other work that's been done within academia and people in the media and the whole range of, I suppose, folks that are coming forward and giving this thoughtful work on what the future might look like and how we might get to whatever future we might get to. But I thought I would just start by reflecting briefly on where we are. So in this part of Ireland, we have no political authority to gather taxes, to set foreign policy, to determine public policy on many, many important issues. Even if the Assembly was in place tomorrow, we wouldn't have that authority. We're governed by London, which has little concern for us. And some of us aren't that enamored by London either. So well, why should we put up with this? I know there's a whole history behind, but why should we? Why do we allow ourselves to be governed by others whom we can't even sack? Whatever about the rights or wrongs of a government here, at least you can get rid of it if you don't like it. So, and why should we put up with sectarianism, with the refusal by some to accord citizens their rights, and then all the ups and downs of the local assembly and the efforts to undermine agreements like the Good Friday Agreement, which citizens have endorsed? And in my strong view, it doesn't have to be like this. Okay, just let's start off on that proposition. It doesn't have to be the way it is at the moment. And we do have the right to self-determination. That is part of the Good Friday Agreement, and that does need to be implemented. And the recent local government election was a good day for United Irelanders. The results saw the number of pro-unity voters in an election in the north outnumber the number of pro-union voters. And that is an important development, but it's only one step along a path which must include those who favour unity, persuading those who don't, or those who are ambivalent, persuading them that unity is the right outcome. And that's a big job of work. And crucially, it means planning. It won't happen just because some of us think it's the right outcome. Change is happening. Sometimes you don't see it. It just creeps up on you, but change is happening. And more change is on the way. And it is important that unionists are involved in this. So let's be very, very clear. Speaking as an Irish Republican, unionists have a place of right on this island. Unionists have a place as of right in the new Ireland. And we want them to be part of what we collectively create. And the union's population and its political representatives working with the rest of us is the surest guarantee that their cultural identity, British and unionist, will prosper and be protected in a new Ireland. And the safeguards that are in the Good Friday Agreement with respect to identity, the cultural and language rights will continue beyond the union. So the DUP obviously should take its place in the executive with the other parties. And for us in Sinn Féin, there's no contradiction. We believe that for us working with the unionists in the assembly and with the other parties and independents, it's all part of working towards a new agreed Ireland. But let's be very clear, we have our work cut out. We know at this point that the British and the Irish governments are against constitutional change and against the referendums. And so are the unionist parties. And there are many reasons for this. For example, the British government is obviously a unionist government that wants to maintain the union. And the Irish government is worried about any national realignment of politics in the time ahead in which establishment parties will lose their dominance. But notwithstanding this and notwithstanding these challenges, our efforts must be focused on challenging the Irish and British governments with the demand for the setting of a date for the referendums. And we must also encourage the governments, and the Irish government in particular, to prepare for the unity referendums and for a successful outcome. But the Irish government not to be doing any preparatory work whatsoever. I know the Shared Island Unit, and I applaud the work of the Shared Island Unit is put forward as an indication of seriousness by the government, but they're actually putting it forward as an alternative to properly planning. All the Shared Island Unit can continue with its work. At the same time, all of the other preparatory work should be going ahead. And the Irish government has chosen to reject any proposals including the establishment of a citizens or a series of citizens' assemblies to facilitate discussion and to plan for the future. Now, we're not arguing that the Citizens' Assembly or assemblies should have the sole responsibility to plan for the future. That's not our position. But they do have a very, very important role to play because they bring citizens in. It's a very good process of participatory democracy. And they also allow experts and others who have either big concerns or a specialism on some issue to come and tease it out. And they're all about informing people. It's to avoid the Brexit factor, that people are fully informed of all the yeses and nos and all of the potentials. And we must remind Dublin again and again that the Good Friday Agreement created a mechanism for constitutional change. And it was overwhelmingly endorsed by the people in referendums north and south. It isn't up to a government to gainsay that. The Irish government, and I remember arguing this 30, 40 years ago, has a constitutional obligation to prepare for unity. Added to that, it's a co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement. So we believe that the Irish government should establish a citizens' assembly to begin the work of planning. We also would argue that the British government and the Irish government should agree a firm date for a unity referendum. And we're not saying this should take place immediately. In fact, we're saying it should take place as part of the process of planning. So you do all the planning, you do all the discussion, you do all the scoping out, the potential. And then at the end of that process, you have your referendum, because obviously for those of us who want a referendum, want to win it. We just don't want to have a referendum for nothing. We want to win it. And therefore we would want to be having the referendum at a time when it's most likely to win, but also at a time when we can progress, where we can ease into a united Ireland, where the vast majority of people seamlessly would feel rightly to be part of all of that process. So that's that. We might in the discussion tease out some of these issues. So once again, I just want to thank you all for being here in such a fine evening, and thank Ireland's Future for the opportunity to speak to you. Gordon Mallow.
Thank you, Jerry. And last but by no means least, Martin, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, and I'm very pleased to contribute to this discussion. And while I have a definite political background, I'm primarily speaking for myself this evening, right? The referendum on the Good Friday Agreement and the outcome in Northern Ireland of the UK-wide Brexit referendum show that it is possible on some major issues to obtain a majority with significant cross-community participation that also coincides with the position of most people throughout Ireland. The immediate challenge of recent years has been to protect and build on the gains made during the peace process. And success in this so far, with strong international backing, has been an important diplomatic achievement. The gains have been peace, greater personal freedom and opportunity, economic and social progress, and scope for deeper cooperation and reconciliation. Over the last 100 years, it was important to keep options open for the future. Now they must be made real and not just theoretical. The choice in the first instance is for the people here, but it also necessarily involves all the people of this island and those who represent them. The UK Brexit vote in 2016 and its consequences have brought the future of this part of Ireland to a head without resolving it. There is general agreement that it would be irresponsible to hold a referendum on the constitutional future without any clear idea of what is to follow should it be successful. At the same time, the outworking of Brexit has shown what a formidable task is involved in making any such change. A lot of hard work has been done by various research institutions, including the Royal Irish Academy's Anne Aarons Project, University College London, and individual experts such as Brendan into many of the detailed choices to be faced. There is, of course, a great difference between a situation where a clear majority of all involved support change in spite of reservations, as was the case with German reunification in 1990, and the position here where the future remains heavily contested. The German case did create one useful precedent that no part of a newly united country has to wait for EU membership that the other part already enjoys. The benefit of Ireland's continuing EU membership is that Northern Ireland alone in the UK will keep access to the EU market and customs union while remaining in the British market. This will confer a big competitive advantage on Northern Ireland once the arrangement settles down. And everyone will benefit from added certainty when Britain inevitably enters some form of external association with the EU. Professor Christine Keneally, leading expert on the Irish famine, now based in America, in a recent radio broadcast described Ireland today as a thriving democracy. Like other societies, it grapples with problems and deficiencies, but it has the means to deal with them. My strongest wish for the future is that Ireland as a whole will become a normal democracy. Such a future has long faced almost insuperable obstacles and been only a distant dream. Today, making democratic institutions here work, and hopefully they will soon resume, requires complex arrangements with, unfortunately, few guarantees of sustainability. It is an open question whether people would want or need such governance safeguards in a united Ireland, when the present Northern Ireland electorate would constitute close to 30% of the whole. And I'd have to say that one of the least fears I would have about a united Ireland is the notion that the population up here, regardless of community, would be unable to hack it in a united Ireland, and that somehow or other there would be a closed shop. Well, I think, you know, the history of Northern Ireland makes that notion absolutely absurd. Even today, there is an Ulster Protestant and Ulster Catholic minister in the Irish cabinet, with only 3 counties in the Republic, while the Garda Commissioner is previously from the Police Service of Northern Ireland. What is certain is that if and when it happens, everyone living or going to live in a united Ireland, regardless of origin or how they might identify or define their national identity, they will insist on having the same civic rights. The majority of ex-unionists outside the 6 counties remained post-1922 and soon discovered there was life after the union. Dr. Gregg, the Protestant Archbishop of Dublin, said in 1936, and I quote from my father, Nicholas Mansergh's book, The Government of Northern Ireland, published that year, quote, This is the Archbishop. We belong to this country. It is for us to take part in its work. It is our business to amalgamate ourselves with the country and make others think of us not as a separate body, but as belonging to the integral life of the community. And a book of post-independence biographical studies 4 years ago, edited by Ian Dalton and Ida Milne, called Protestant and Irish, substantiates that ideal. A premature referendum that was lost by whatever margin could risk a long postponement of a different constitutional future, as it has done in Quebec, Cyprus, and Scotland. I share the view expressed recently by Gerry Adams and repeated by him today, that a border poll should be held when it is most likely to pass, which is effectively what the Good Friday Agreement says. It is important not to excite hopes that that moment is likely to happen soon. The Irish government has to be careful in its words and actions, given its shared responsibility with the British government for both preserving peace and implementing the Good Friday Agreement. I don't think it's correct to say that, I'm talking about the main parties here, that they don't want to see a united Ireland. I think most of them do. I certainly do, but we are aware, as I'm sure most people in this room are aware, that it is a fraught and difficult task to bring home. There are many positive actions the government can take right now in promoting and co-funding projects of benefit to the whole island as part of the Shared Island Initiative, which has already been referenced, in addition to supporting the work of the North-South bodies under the agreement. Stephen's Alliance Party, increasingly a third force in Northern politics, focuses on practical things that can be advanced now to improve people's lives. Not unity on its own, but unity in harmony and friendship is, since 1998, Ireland's constitutional imperative. How that is to be achieved will require much ongoing reflection and debate. It would include the opportunity to reshape and harmonise the unique relationship between Britain and Ireland as neighbouring states, one inside, one outside the EU, certainly as things are at present. The alternative to unity is not a return to unbalanced power relationships of the past, but the development of closer partnership on this island and between these islands within the framework of the agreement and its provisions for protecting equality, identity, and self-determination. In other words, I think everybody needs to be clear that a lot of change will be taking place irrespective of and before any referendum on Irish unity happens. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone for that. So we know that the UK government, the Secretary of State, can call a border poll at any time. However, it's widely accepted that it would be or should be, when in their view, the majority of people would favour Irish unity. So so far, the UK government has refused to outline the conditions for that. What do you think the conditions are, Brendan?
Thank you for the easy one. There are several methods that could be used that would survive a court inspection. One would be a majority in the Northern Ireland Assembly of parties elected with a mandate to promote a referendum. That would mean, for example, that the Alliance Party could back the idea of a referendum to decide matters without having to take a position itself. if we take traditional British parliamentary representation seriously, a majority of MPs elected from Northern Ireland to the Westminster Parliament in favour of holding a referendum would surely count for something. Both of those methods would involve highlighting actual real votes, which politicians, particularly in populist mode, tend to emphasize. The third approach is to look at survey evidence. And here there are important differences. And here I have to admit that I have a stake in these debates. Stratified probability survey sampling is expensive, and when done well, produces very reliable results. By and large, those surveys, I've been associated with two, show lower support for unification at present than internet panel-based surveys. Those are cheaper. Those rely upon panels which typically are samples of people who are highly engaged, or at least they overrepresent the engaged. So what our surveys tend to do is to get the elderly who are not internet savvy, and they get the disengaged. And those categories of persons will really matter in a referendum, because if a referendum is held on this vital subject, turnout will be massive. You all know that the dead will vote, or at least people will try to get the dead to vote, and sometimes more than once. So procedural and transparent fairness will be important. And what I suggest to you is, at the moment, survey work of the expensive kind shows discrepant results from those based on internet polling. They're both broadly consistent. There's a rising trajectory of support for unification in both sets. But if you went off internet polling, you would be calling referendums sooner than if you relied on surveys. Now, I don't expect change to be simply incremental. I think the Northern Nationalist vote has resumed the long-term growth it experienced between 1969 and roughly 2003. It was stagnant for a long time. I expect it to resume that growth. But I also expect discontinuous change. So these are all different ways of saying I have some sympathy with the position of a UK Secretary of State. And if you'll forgive me for lengthening my answer, it's important to recognize that the UK's Secretary of State's decision is justiciable. It can be taken to court. That's why they're deeply reluctant to specify in advance the criteria that they will decide upon. It has to be a decision that appears reasonable. That is to say, if they are calling it on the basis that they believe opinion has sufficiently shifted. Now, you're right that a referendum could be called by an unscrupulous and Machiavellian unionist Secretary of State who was confident that the union side would win. And I think that is another argument for why the government of Ireland has to be prepared, because in those circumstances, it's still possible that the Secretary of State could be wrong and there would be a surprising result. So short answer, votes in real elections should matter in any objective determination, and survey work. But there's a problem in the different styles of survey work. I expect over time, internet polling in the North will begin to resemble survey work because the elderly will all be internet savvy, those under 65 particularly, and perhaps also the levels of engagement will rise as the prospect becomes more evident. Thank you for that long-winded reply, Professor O'Leary.
Yes, I actually can see that Jerry's indicating that he wants to speak on this. Jerry, I'm going to just come to you in a second. And I also wanted you to address the date question, because if you're asking the UK government to set a date, what date do you want? And I know you've previously said yesterday, but realistically, what date do you want? Just before we move to you, Jerry, Brendan, just a quick, very short answer to this question.
Yes,
It
I
was
promise.
highlighted to me that some of the language in the Good Friday Agreement is gendered. So when it refers to the Secretary of State, it refers to them as a male, as a he. Does that make a difference? Can that be challenged if the Secretary of State was a woman?
It's quite clear in UK public law that the use of the gender pronoun in that case is meant to be impersonal.
Okay, thank you. Right, Jerry?
Yeah, Cormac, Amanda. Well, first of all, I think this is above a Secretary of State's pay grade. No Secretary of State will take this decision. This is a decision for the whole of the British government. And he or she is unlikely to set out the criteria in the meantime. Because this is essentially a political issue. The decision will be taken by a British government, but at this time, it doesn't even have to seriously consider it. Because the other co-guarantor of the agreement, this isn't the British government's agreement, it has two co-guarantors, two co-signatories. The other one, the Irish government, isn't even approaching the British government about this issue, or indeed about other aspects of the Good Friday Agreement, which are in default at this at this time. So I think we need to be, really consider for a second a government which doesn't plan for the future. And I mean, that's a very open remit. It's a government which is going to let everybody down until it knuckles down to actually saying, how can we move into a different future than the one we've had thus far? Let's go and talk to the Brits about it. They're not doing that. Just to even to have an open discussion about how this could be put together. And remember, Sinn Féin and any sensible advocate of unity wants the referendum to happen after all of the issues have been dealt with. And in fact, some of the issues may, I think, have actually been acted upon. The change is happening every single day that we're, as I said in my remarks, it sort of happens almost when you're not watching. So the date, Mary Lou has said she'd like to see this in this decade, but the date is totally conditional on having that necessary planning process, which I believe should, and Sinn Féin believes, should have the maximum amount of participation by as many people as it's possible to get involved in it. And I mean, I would be quite hopeful. There have been two big issues recently. One indeed was the Good Friday Agreement. Majority of people here voted for it. Despite all the brouhaha, despite all the understandable angst about release of prisoners and the standing down of the RUC and all of the rest, the majority voted for it. Similarly with Brexit, the majority voted against it. So there's a majority of people here who, on a given day, will do the right thing. And what we have to do is to create the atmosphere where that can be done as seamlessly as possible and as inclusively as possible.
Martin, you had mentioned that you disagreed with Jerry whenever it came to his comments regarding the Irish government not wanting to have the referendum. Could you just flesh that out a little bit as concisely as you can, but also address the issue that the political landscape across Ireland is changing, that Sinn Féin and to an extent the Greens and some of the very sort of small micro parties have an all-island presence, but that is something that all political parties are going to be considering?
That question, but I just want to address the previous question as well. I mean, it is true that, I mean, I can remember Owen Paterson saying to me personally when he was Secretary of State, that it was in his discretion to call a referendum at any time. But the reality is, with the Scottish situation, it's very difficult to envisage any British government or Secretary of State allowing one here while they are resisting one in Scotland. That would be a very difficult position for them to defend. Now, I think there is a difference of appreciation between the present Irish government and the Sinn Féin position as articulated by Jerry. And of course, this will be one of the issues put before the electorate in another year or year and a half, you know, as to how far you want to push it. I think the present Irish government, the way I understand their position, is they fear that if they become too proactive on this issue, that they raise tensions here. And there are always sort of conspiracy theorists on the other side who think that you know the government wants to override or bypass you know the provisions that are in the Good Friday Agreement. Now, I'm not overly concerned about the definition of how the Secretary of State acts. I mean, I would like a referendum to take place when it is clear by nearly all measures that it would have a good chance of passing. I am very suspicious, I'm afraid, of opinion polls, whether internet or otherwise. They don't always have, over the last 30, 40 years, they don't always have a good track record.
Politician in populist mode.
Yeah, well, no, well,
I warned you about him.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm not a politician anymore, and I don't think there's anything particularly populist about it. It is just that you know, to base a poll pure, unless the opinion polls are very consistent, pointing all in one direction. But if you've got contradictory polls with widely diverging results, because I actually think a defeated poll would be a disaster.
Okay.
And therefore it should not be held until, and my problem with setting a date is that you don't know what's going to happen, and particularly if you're talking about, say, 5, 8, 10 years, you don't know what's going to happen in the meantime. So I actually think that politicians should keep themselves flexible, and they should actually be you know, be opportunistic, move faster if the conditions seem right, and slower if they don't.
Thank you. Stephen, we know that when the former Alliance MLA Anna Lowe spoke to the Irish News about her particular preferences, there was quite a bit of uproar about that. Given all of the position of the Alliance Party, which I understand very well, why should current Alliance reps not be free to outline their personal preference if they have one?
Well, but they are free, but I suppose the reality is that most Alliance representatives are generally open-minded on the issue. That's the way I would articulate my own position, and most of my colleagues would say the same. But there's no bar on people saying this. But to be straight, I mean, this is not something that most of our representatives are campaigning on at present, or there's no sort of pushing demand in the party for people to say, I want to come out in an African pro-Union position or pro-United Ireland position. We are respectful of the debate that's happening. And the vast majority of our elected reps are in that space where they are wanting to take part in discussions and to see how things go in that regard, and look at and test the evidence. And on the point as well around the measurement issue, I mean, there's no perfect answer to this. It is always going to be something that is with a degree of uncertainty. My instinct is that a succession of opinion polls is probably the least unreliable measurement of this, if the frame it as double negative. But it would need to be something that's consistent over time. The difficulty with doing it through political parties is there's a whole range of reasons why people vote for political parties. And if that does become the measurement, then very quickly elections themselves will become a sorting mechanism for people's desire about how they trigger a border poll or not. And the converse would be, if you look at if you say simply it has to be a majority of the nationalist parties, overtly nationalist parties, that may negate that there are people who are voting for Alliance who are already pro-United Ireland and pro a referendum taking place. That wouldn't necessarily be captured. You could go the full hog and go a vote in the Assembly itself. That presupposes we still have the Assembly at that stage, given where things are currently at. And secondly, at this stage, I don't think the evidence would warrant us as a party certainly pushing that button. We're still some way from that particular point.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Obviously, as a journalist, I'm very well aware that outrage stories tend to be sort of bread and butter when it comes to Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland, however you choose to describe this place. And one that's in the headlines over the last day or so is the North Belfast MP John Finucane is due to speak at an upcoming event in South Armagh, paying tribute to IRA volunteers. I'm just wondering what the panel thinks is, do you think, you know, we heard at the Queen's conference about where we'd failed in reconciliation and so on. Do you think attendance at those sort of Republican events or loyalist events or state events that upset others, does that help or hinder reconciliation? Does it help or hinder the Unity Project? I'll maybe start with you, Jerry.
Yeah, well,
and also just a further point, do we need to move beyond the conversation where we say that everybody has the right to remember their dead?
well, everybody does have the right to remember their dead. And I've talked to unionists, and I don't want to name names, but I've talked at length to unionist leaders about this. See, I accept that there were brave UDR soldiers, brave British soldiers, brave IUC officers, and brave prison officers. And they all have families. And if they want to come together, as long as it's done in a respectful way, if they want to come together, because every community, every state, every country in the world does this, and pay homage or celebrate or whatever way the sacrifices that were made. So we just have to learn to let people do in a dignified way whatever they think is appropriate, particularly for the families. You know, I still hear the IRA described as terrorists. You know, the news media.
Cycle, do you think the cycle sort of helps or hinders what you're
bear
trying
with
to do?
Bear with me. When South Africa got democracy, they woke up one morning to the fact that the biggest terrorist in the land was the president. And there was a very interesting program on Channel 4 where all the journalists were brought in together to try and deal with this new situation that had been condemning Mandela for the previous decades as a terrorist and so on, and now he was the president. So they had to, rework all of this. People who have been victims of any of the combatant forces obviously deserve our concern, and particularly those who are embittered, understandably, by that process. But I've been down at in South Armagh where that event takes place, and part of the little bit that I saw about it was that there's that children will be there. Republicans have children. What do? You bring them out. They're not being indoctrinated. They're having a bit of crack. They're getting running around the place. It's a beautiful part of the world. So let's just relax a wee bit and into this. The dead will take care of themselves. We need to be looking after the living in the time ahead, and just relax a wee bit on all of this and understand that there are separate narratives here. And it's only when you set all the narratives side by side that you get the full picture. So we should be beyond, we're 25 years or so after the Good Friday Agreement. We should be beyond not the personal hurt of the families who have been bereaved or had injured members, but we should be beyond political games playing on issues like this.
Does anybody else on the panel have any thoughts on that? Stephen, yours?
Sure, yeah. Come to no surprise, take a different view on this. We regard both IRA and loyalist terrorists as terrorists. And we are deeply uncomfortable with anything that would come across as glorification of violence. We don't believe that violence had any justification in the past, and it doesn't have any justification in our society today. We do recognise that people do have the right to commemorate those who have died, particularly families, and our desire would be that it's done sensitively, and there's a fine line to walk in that regard between doing that and anything that is seen as glorification or justification of violence. That said, I do recognise, we've had a peace process. Our society has moved on considerably in terms of the level of violence in our society. There's still residual issues we have to address on a range of different fronts. But our society has moved on, and we've built a political process, and obviously Sinn Féin are a partner in government in Northern Ireland, and obviously they're a major player in southern politics as well. That's the reality. But yeah, that is uncomfortable, and I think I will be doing you a disservice if I didn't say that is something that will be a consideration for some people in terms of the wider debate around the future of the island.
Okay.
Sorry?
Then whenever so everyone go ahead.
Yeah, personally, I would have a lot of respect for Pat Finucane. I think, these matters are to be judged by the people concerned. Sorry, John Finucane, sorry. By the people concerned, though I do notice that sometimes when it's politicized, it seems to be a strong element of the pot calling the kettle black, I've spoken many times at, most recently in February, at old IRA commemorations, including anti-treaty old IRA commemorations, even though I am of my grandparents would have been unionists. But that is part of what the process that led to the formation of
Lauren, do
a
you
state.
think then that there's layers of hypocrisy that are at play, and that the reconciliation piece needs to be discussed further, because every day there is an anniversary or a commemoration of someone that you have the same story.
Well, I think you sometimes have to balance, conflicting interests, conflicting rights. But this arose, during the peace process. Jerry will remember he was pictured, after the bombing of the Shankill Butcher's shop, and Albert Reynolds had to explain to John Major why he was doing that, and why he had to do that.
And Brendan, what can people do who are in favour of Irish unity to reassure unionists that their identity would be protected and cherished in a new Ireland? What do you think are practical things that can be done?
The first and most straightforward is to emphasise that their British citizenship rights will be recognised and respected by any future government of Ireland, though of course their British citizenship rights will depend upon the government of Great Britain preserving those rights. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the history of British withdrawal from various parts of the world has been one in which those citizenship rights have not been persistently protected. So it might be a reasonable thing to have a treaty of understanding which would protect British citizenship rights of Northerners in a future united Ireland. That, in my view, it's an unfortunate problem, because though the most hardline unionists absolutely do not want to be called Irish, many of them are, by contrast, pragmatically taking out Irish passports because it's an easier way to travel. That way they have citizenship, and they could therefore potentially exercise the full rights of citizenship. That's number one. Culturally, I think questions need to be addressed about the status of Irish and Ulster Scots. I think it's the case that the Irish language is now safe. It's actually expanding in usage, and therefore the absolute requirement that it be the national language and prevail in Supreme Court decision-making over the English text, with which most lawyers are likely to be more familiar, is something that could be considered. Protection for Ulster Scots, where there's demand for it, should be considered. I think a lot of symbolic questions are more tradable and people are more flexible if given an opportunity to reflect on the matter. In Aaron's, we intend to explore the extent to which people will be willing to contemplate symbolic changes on coinage, for example, on postage stamps and so on. It'll be interesting to explore the degree of flexibility and tolerance among the public. But the big institutional question is whether or not a united Ireland should, at least initially, be one in which a Northern Assembly persists in a united Ireland. It's clear that Protestants prefer that option. It's clear also that when you have a deliberative forum, that's a miniature citizens' assembly, that their enthusiasm for that idea begins to diminish. So it's not a hard and fast position, but it's an important one that the government of Ireland needs to consider. There are all sorts of institutional consequences that flow from the potential elimination of Northern Ireland as a political unit, and those all need to be thought through.
Brendan,
I could go on for hours,
Brendan,
but I won't.
Just a quick question. Do you think that there's merit in a provincial system? You could have 4.
There's no demand, serious demand by any political party for a federation based on the 4 provinces. I believe some miniature faction of Republican Sinn Féin still holds to the old Era Nua idea. The main problem for Northern Ireland Protestants is they deliberately sought 6 counties, not 9 counties, to maximize their chances of being dominant. They deliberately allowed both the partition of Ireland and of Ulster. So going back to the recreation of Ulster would in fact seem to them creating a bigger majority against them than the likely majority that is about to prevail sometime in the next decade.
Farry, you had indicated you wanted to comment on that, and I think we'll throw it to the floor because we're a little over time now.
Yeah, just very, very briefly, in defense of John Finucane. These events happen within Republican communities regularly. And unlike Stephen, they don't see the people and the families who they might respect as being terrorists. They might see the British as being terrorists. They might see the loyalists who were mostly run by the British as being terrorists. But John Finucane met with King Charles just a week ago. He has nothing in common with him. He's as a Republican, he's opposed to that sense of, divine right and monarchy and all that nonsense, But others have a different view. So you have to respect that. So John then goes and shows his respect for those who have a different view. And it wouldn't be the first time he's done that. And we all know that Michelle and Alex Maskey went to the coronation. So there needs to be, you said something which I didn't think about earlier on, Amanda, and your journalistic head on you, that negative makes news. Well, there you go. This makes news. Secondly, and finally, the reason we disagree about the past is because we haven't agreed about the future. That's the reason that's the logic of that. Now, the Civil War, just 100 years, last Sunday, symbolically, the ending of the Civil War was marked in a very dignified ceremony. So, I just think we need to be sensible and all the time look to the future. And if we are going to go to events like the one in South Armagh, they should be respectful and they should be dignified and so on. But we shouldn't feed the negativity, which is totally and absolutely unnecessary in this day and age, 25 years on.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions in the audience? Anything that anybody wants to ask? Anyone with a burning question? Yep, Chris, go ahead.
I always have burning questions, Amanda. It's actually, I'm going to start by saying, give another plug for Brendan's book. I think it's, if people haven't bought it, if you're truly interested in the subject, it's by far the most authoritative study on this. Brendan, you can keep saying that. It's actually what I wanted to do was the same. issue, and I do think it was picked up in certain ways. But I think the reasons for that are instructive. And I think when you talk about that, and I'm not talking about you personally, Brendan, what people in this audience, and keep in mind, people in the north of Ireland know each other so well. What people hear is a reconfiguration of the unionist leader. Very clear. That's what they hear. When they watch and hear Ian Beasley speaking about wanting a supermajority, when they see unionist politicians at the last election refusing to say they would serve all unionists, refused to say they would serve alongside a nationalist leader as First Minister. And they hear a unionist politician only last week on television say it was against the wish of a united Ireland and reconciliation for Sinn Féin who want to win seats from unions. And what my question actually is, because I know, man, that's important to ask a question. Do you see, and all of that stems from the same place, unionist entitlement, something that has been dismantling over the last 25 years as part of the peace process? And do you see, Brennan, in particular, if you don't mind me asking, the dismantling of unionist entitlement as being part of winning losers' consent? That mindset of residual privilege that has continues to manifest itself in our politics. That actually, and in one sense, it speaks to what Jerry's just talked about. That we can listen to people like Stephen wearing a poppy and talk about allowing people to respect British soldiers in this part of Ireland, but that there's terrorists when we want to do it for Republicans. That challenging that notion of privilege is actually part of winning losers' consent.
Okay, Brendan, if you want to address that one.
Just briefly, I would say that part and parcel of cultural equality is precisely underlying equality. Yes, historically, Protestants, Unionists, Loyalists, and British people, not all of them, but significant numbers, have had a culture of superiority, which most of us know has its origins in the colonial past. It survived the formation of partition. It survived the outbreak of the civil rights movement. I detect a significant shift. I think the fact that 2/3 of that community will openly say they'll accept the outcome of a referendum, some say happily, but a minority. I think that's very serious progress. And I don't conclude that smaller group, those who would find unity almost impossible to accept, because of the way that's phrased, it's impossible to conclude they're all just waiting to plant bombs in the streets of Dublin or to immediately withdraw. I don't think it means that. I think for most of them, I would be psychologically shocked if Irish unity went ahead. I would be emotionally traumatized by it. And that's an understandable political sentiment. So my broad answer to your question is yes.
Thank you, Brendan. And arguably maybe Northern nationalists are best placed to understand how loyalists would feel in a new Ireland and facilitate making that a little bit easier. Whenever we were talking previously, we talked about unionist political leaders. Some have their head in the sand, some are actively engaged in constitutional conversations and engaged in forums such as Together UK and so on to try to promote the benefits of the union. Do you think something that you had said about expecting people to negotiate the terms of their surrender? Could you just address that briefly before we move to the next question?
Certainly. So people often argue that unionists should engage on Irish unification. I simply said, if I was asked to be their advisor, and by the way, I haven't been asked to be their advisor, just in case you thought otherwise. If I was their advisor, I would do what they're doing. They would say, no, we will not negotiate until we've lost, and we'd rather talk about something else. That doesn't mean, however, that the government of Ireland or Northern nationalists can't find ways, ethical ways, of finding out exactly what unionists, loyalists, Protestants are most concerned about. That's precisely how you can use deliberative fora, focus groups, other forms of interaction with people to find out their perspectives. And indeed, despite the divisions here, people do read one another's newspapers. They do have some consciousness of the other group. It's not all total estrangement.
Okay, and anyone else? I'll come to you in a second, Morton, but just questions. The lady at the very back of the room. We're going to have someone run to you with a mic. If we can wrestle out of Chris's hand. That's grand. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So thanks for this evening. It's been really informative and interesting. So my question, I suppose, I guess is the flip about it's a term I've heard recently, castle Catholics, and about the, so where you think you're better off in a united Britain rather than, and not in a united Britain, in Britain rather than a united Ireland. Do you see citizens panels as being a way of addressing those concerns?
Is there anyone in particular you'd like to answer that question?
I guess Jerry, because he spoke about it the most.
Okay, Jerry.
I don't fully understand the question.
Okay, so in terms of, you've spoken about, sorry, it was Brendan who spoke about the people that they look at the polls who are interested in a united Ireland, and there's some Catholics that may feel that they're better off staying as part of the union. So in terms of sort of those concerns, do you think that, so talking in a citizen forum would be a way of exploring what those issues are and finding answers to them? So in particular around rights of women and children.
Can you agree with that, Jerry? Yeah.
Does that make sense? Sorry, I
think
think
so.
nervous.
Yep, but if anybody else has just one or two more questions, so the person with the mic knows, this lady at the front next and the gentleman with the blue shirt, then the gentleman in the corner, and then I'll do a final question. We'll have to wrap up.
Well, thanks for the question. And the stats have shown that there are people from within cultural Catholicism who would be concerned about the economy, or would be concerned that we need to have a public health system and so on. So, and also would be concerned about perhaps loyalist violence. I think we want, a really, and this is why the work of Ireland's Future is so important, and why people come to the forums that it organises, because they're interested. I think we need, from the ground upwards, as detailed, as intense discussions as are possible. And Sinn Féin has appointed a commission which is currently organising people's assemblies throughout the island, and we've had 4 thus far, and they have been wonderful. I didn't think at this stage that people from a unionist background would come to a Sinn Féin event, but people did. And people came onto the platform, and people spoke from the floor in Belfast and in Derry and in other places. We're also organising a women's assembly and a youth assembly. So they're all means of if you like, stepping outside of the party political thing and giving the people their say. And there's a phrase which is current at the moment, the persuadables. Those of us who want a united Ireland need to be persuading those who are, and I said this in my remarks earlier, those who are dilatory or who are against it or who haven't made their minds up. But we because all the science will argue that Ireland as a single unit will be better. Now, obviously, that depends who's in government. But speaking for the party that I'm part of, we want a national public health service. People have a right. That's the essence of republicanism, that citizens have rights. And that includes, in this day and age, the right to a home, the right to health, the right to a clean environment. I mean, these are the modern versions of citizens' rights. So I think it's a matter of talking and listening. I think we also need to proactively listen, by the way. And the more of these conversations, the better. And all of the folks here, I don't know what the politics of the people in this room are, but go out and have that conversation with your family and your workplace and in the pub. Just keep it going, keep the conversation going.
Thanks, Jerry. Just the mic to the lady at the front here in the white top. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like your gut reaction to this question. As part of the reassurance to unionists, would you invite the Orange Order to march at the River Boyne?
Yes, I was TD and I did exactly that. And I actually met the Orange to ask them to come down.
Okay.
I was a TD in Louth.
And everybody else is on board with the Orange Order getting involved. Okay. If we could just pass the mic back to the gentleman in the blue shirt at the 2 rows back.
Hi, thanks very much to everyone. Not trying to undermine the work you've done, Brendan, but just a question about surveys, because I know people are saying that that's a method people can use, but it's been shown on constitutional issues that surveys, unfortunately, don't have very good predictive power for constitutional issues. We know that for voting intentions for parties, they do. People know what they're voting for, they know what the party is, but if you're being asked to vote on something that you have no idea what it is, it's an abstraction. It doesn't make any sense. So we've seen this in Scotland when Alex Salmond sat down with David Cameron to agree to the referendum. Only 28% of people supported Scottish independence, and it could be argued that that was the only reason that the Conservatives actually agreed to it at the time. At the point of the election, 45% of people voted. So the argument actually that surveys can be used for criteria to predict what the outcome is going to be, I would suggest is deeply flawed. And so more stable measures would be around voting for political parties and demographic changes. So it's just a comment. And just another quick point, it's really around, people have mentioned that they think that Brexit has been the fact a game changer for people. But the argument is it's not actually Brexit that's the issue, because if the UK was to rejoin the EU, I don't think that would solve the situation for people in Ireland, or, for example, for people from Scotland. It's more that was a wake up and smell the coffee moment, because people realise that 85% of the people in England will make decisions on your behalf because they will vote as part of the UK as a whole, and that can carry on for other issues as well. So it suggests that people are excessively focused on Brexit, but it's not really that. It's the fact that less than 3% of the population.
Great, thank you. Brendan, if you just want to reply to that briefly, and while you're doing that, if we get the mic over to the gentleman with the glasses on the other side of the room, and then we'll wrap things up with a final question. Thank you.
It's a good question, a good comment. I don't want to overemphasize the merits of surveys. What I do want to say is that if they're used, they could be a guide to a Secretary of State. As he's defined in the legal text, his responsibility is actually even more difficult. He has to predict campaign effects. Now, I'm not saying for one moment that surveys will predict what will happen in a campaign. I would go further in the Scottish case. Of course, the Tories held the referendum because they thought they'd win. And they nearly lost it. It went from 27% to 50% until Gordon Brown intervened in the campaign. And that's when it went back to 45. So campaign effects can be huge, and you can't use surveys to predict what will happen in campaigns.
Okay, and the final question, yeah.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks for this evening. I think as the conversations continue, I think we're moving from a point where the how is much more important than the what. I think the vision of a new Ireland is rapidly being crystallized. I get slightly frustrated from the academic community, who seem unduly constrained by the existing constitutional provisions and the existing mechanism in the Good Friday Agreement. It's the principle of consent which is immovable. I think we've got to the point now where we've realized that the mechanism is not rational. The mechanism that is dependent on the British Secretary of State, however she's feeling that particular day, to determine our constitutional future is simply not tenable any longer, and we need to be much more creative. Professor O'Leary outlined the bind that we're in that we don't want to vote early and lose it, but we want everything set in advance. We actually don't need everything set in advance.
Okay.
There are two major, just very quickly, Amanda, there are two major questions we need resolved. A new constitution through a constitutional forum, and we need a fiscal settlement. Now that just means, what does the money look like for 20 years? Those are the two big questions that we need to know in advance. And I would be arguing for a gradualist approach, which is as easy as 1, 2, 3. A simple vote in the Northern Ireland Assembly can call an indicative referendum to deliver the answer to those two questions, and then we can have a final referendum. So really what I would suggest, my question really is, should we be constrained by the existing mechanisms in the Good Friday Agreement?
Brendan's got his hand up for that one.
What your proposal would do is create intense uncertainty about the status of Northern Ireland in that interval. And that would be intensely destabilizing. If you have both a referendum on principle and then a referendum to ratify, I don't think that's a wise idea. And nor do I think you'll build public support for it.
And Brendan, you've also said that you don't think that the referendums have to take place at the same time, that they could.
The wording is concurrent. Concurrent means a joint decision. Two chambers of a parliament make concurrent decisions. They don't have to make them on the same day. Okay. That's a choice for the government of Ireland. The UK calls a referendum. The government of Ireland can decide to hold a referendum on the same day, or it can decide to leave an interval. The argument for leaving an interval is that if the North doesn't vote yes for unification, why put the South through a lot of institutional transformation that may be unnecessary? I'm not saying that's the position they should take. I can
see Jerry Adams smiling here at that prospect.
They could.
Do you have any thoughts on it, Jerry?
No, I think Brent's wrong on that, but that
wrong about the legal interpretation, or wrong about?
It should be on the one day. I
mean, I accept that people can argue for that. Yeah.
Well, not only should we argue for it, but we should try and make it happen, because that was part of the core. And Martin Mansergh and I spent years, and others working this out, that the right to self-determination and the mechanism for it would be, as it happened in the Good Friday Agreement, on the same day. But that to one side, I agree with our friend up here in relation to we need a new constitution. And that might be when we talk about preparatory work, a new constitution, a government in Dublin starting to put together a new constitution and getting Northern input into it, and so on and so forth. And obviously the fiscal package is necessary as well.
And Stephen, you wanted to speak, and sort of Martin as well.
Just a point to further complicate things, and of course not that I'm advocating anything necessarily, but there is a point here about how the UK and Irish governments will actually join us up at some stage. So whenever Brendan talks about concurrent referendums, legally it will be the UK government that runs the referendum, or the electoral office and the electoral commission, but under the aegis of the UK government, and it'll be the UK government that influences the question that is set in this particular jurisdiction. It will be the Irish government that sets the question in the south. So exactly how those are going to be reconciled does presuppose a certain degree of coordination, and insofar as there is this discussion and indeed some degree of a qualified consensus that there does need to be more advanced planning, potentially with a role for the Irish government. That perhaps is no, I'm just theorising, Jerry, theorising at the moment on a purely speculative basis. But that discussion may end up in a different track from what the UK government does with any question here. So there does need to be a coming together of the two governments around how this process is to be managed, if and when it ever happens.
Right, Martin, people have their homes to get to, so briefly, please.
Yeah, just 3 points about a new constitution. My position on that would be betwixt and between. The 1937 constitution was actually to a considerable extent based on the 1922 constitution. There are a lot of jurisprudence and people's rights through courts' decisions get built up. So a complete scrapping, now that used to be the PD policy, but I think is not a good idea. But I think there would have to be substantial constitutional change. I'm not.
And Martin,
yeah, second. So I have 2 quick points to make. Is one of the famous sound bites attributed to Mikhail Gorbachev in 1989, when the German Democratic Republic were celebrating their 40th anniversary, and this is a few weeks before the fall of the Berlin Wall. History punishes those who move too late or who move too slowly. That was clearly the case for Southern or Irish Unionists they did eventually come round to Home Rule and even Dominion, but they came too late. They resisted it for too long. I mean, even somebody as unlikely perhaps as Conor Cruise O'Brien did advise Unionists at least 20 years ago that they shouldn't wait to the last possible minute to get engaged. My final point with this is and I said it in one of my original statement, I actually think in current circumstances, the strongest argument for a united Ireland is to create a normal democracy in this island and across this island. It would be very difficult, with all due respect to Northern Ireland, it would be very difficult to describe it at any point over the last 100 years as a normal democracy. Perhaps it should be tried.
Okay, and just we're going to do, yep. We're just going to go down the line, quick fire, no long speeches. 25 years, what next? In 25 years from now, will people in this jurisdiction be living in a new Ireland? Brendan?
Yes.
Stephen?
Thank you.
Martin?
It won't be what we currently have, but I'm not presupposing what it's going to be.
Martin?
Probably, but I don't know.
And Jerry?
If we do the right things, yes. And
Okay.
Stephen will be there with.
Okay, well, thanks to our panel, Brendan, Stephen, Martin and Jerry, and thank you all for your attention. Thank you.